and welcome to The Well again. I am Christy Hurt, the director of the daycare here at The Well, and today is a very special day. Just like Mark told you whenever he first welcomed you, it's so great. I know those of you on film can't see it, but we have been speaking to an empty room for 7 weeks now, so it's been great to now see some faces in here, even though you're all mask covered and I can just see your eyes. It's nice to see some faces in here and be able to look out and know we're actually talking to some people. The people that are here today are part of our dream team. So I know Mark told you a little bit about how to be on our dream team, and we'll be telling you a little bit more about that after the service too. So last week, we started our series on Esther. And as Mark said, Esther has been one of my favorite books since I was a little girl at church camp. So I've heard many people this week tell me that Esther is also one of their favorite books, but that they've learned new things just even last week in the series, because most of you know about Esther I found out from VeggieTales. So VeggieTales can only teach you so much. And I will say that VeggieTales is the G-rated version of Esther, and Esther is not a G-rated book at all. So just to recap from last week really quickly, we looked at the first 3 chapters, and we looked mostly at the characters, kind of what they were doing. So during those first 3 chapters, we learned that King Xerxes is all about letting people know that he's large and in charge and how awesome he is. We learned that Queen Vashti refused a request to come and see him, and so he kicked her to the curb. And then he rounded up all the beautiful virgins of the land, whether they wanted to come with him or not, and he chose Esther as queen. Now then we saw that Haman, who was kind of Xerxes' mini-me, who wanted to also be powerful, that he sent an edict out to all of the Jews that they were going to be slaughtered. And this all was because of Mordecai, who was Esther's cousin, did not bow down to him when he wanted him to. So that's kind of our recap. Last week we talked about how at the end of those first 3 chapters that it seems like we're kind of in a hopeless place. And we talked about in our own lives how sometimes we can be in that hopeless place. And I actually had a few people that reached out to me this week and talked about that that's where they feel they are right now. But remember last week I told you there's lots more chapters to go in this book. And so you're going to be feeling, hopefully by the end of this, a little less hopeless and see, just like we sang Waymaker, how even when we don't see it, that God is moving all the time. So we are going to jump right into chapter 4 today, and we're going to start by looking at Mordecai. And the chapter starts where Mordecai has just heard about this edict and his reaction to it. So we're looking at Esther chapter 4. We're going to look at the first 3 verses. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he only went as far as the king's gates. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Now, when we're upset today, something happens to us and we're in mourning, we don't use sackcloth and ashes. That's not something that's part of our culture today. In fact, really, in the American culture, mourning isn't really dealt with very well at all. People on Facebook will send their thoughts and prayers, and then after a few weeks, we're just pretty much told to suck it up and get on with our lives. But in the Jewish culture, mourning lasted for a long time, and it was a very physical, outward process. With this, if you look where Mordecai was at, he was at the city gates in this sackcloth, wailing. And if you remember from last week, Mordecai worked at the city gates. So he was with people that knew him. He wasn't afraid to show his emotions and show what was going on to those people that knew him. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't things like that. And sometimes that can happen to us. If we have something going on and we're upset, we might go hide in the bathroom to cry, or we might try to kind of get away and seclude ourselves from people. But we can look at this and see he was right out in the open with people that he knew. The sackcloth and ashes that many of the Jews were wearing symbolized not only the Jews' poverty in their spirit, but also their complete deadness without Christ and without God at that time. The prophet Joel kind of told us a little bit more about what this means. So if we look at Joel chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, he says, "Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart, not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. And he relents from sending calamity." So last week we talked about how the Jews were so assimilated with the Persians because Esther was able to go in as queen and no one even knew that she was a Jew. But because they were so assimilated, they had lost their protective covering and their identity as God's chosen people. The Jews were going through some really hard times in this passage. And we're going to look today at a few different ways that hard times can help us and some different lessons that we can learn from those hard times. One of the things that hard times can do is to lead you back to God. Remember, the reason for all of this was because Mordecai would not bow down to Haman. Well, Haman did succeed in driving Mordecai to his knees. He succeeded in driving all the Jews to their knees, but not to their knees in honor of Haman or any man, but he drove them to their knees back to honor God and back to seek him for guidance. Now, while all of this was going on, Esther was back in the palace. When she found out what was happening with Mordecai at the city gate, she sent him clothes to change into. She just wanted to give him a quick fix without really knowing what the problem is. And that's something that we can do a lot. We see somebody, I talked a little bit about our American culture and mourning. Sometimes we see people who are upset, and it's uncomfortable for us to listen to them or to let them cry on our shoulders or to just sit with them while they're mourning. We want to fix their problems. And that's how Esther was. She knew that this beloved cousin who had taken care of her was upset, and she just wanted to fix it. But Mordecai informed her that the only way she could help would be to go to Xerxes, the king, and tell him her true heritage as a Jew, and then beg for his mercy from all of the Jews. Now, this might sound easy. She was the queen, he was the king. She could just go to her husband and ask him to make a new edict. Remember, he couldn't change. We talked about that last week. You can't change something, but he could make something new to help her out. But in the Persian culture, the only way for anyone, even for the queen, to go to the king is if he asked for her to come. And he had not asked for her for the last 30 days. Now, if she came and asked to be seen by him, if he would lift his golden scepter for her to come in and she would touch it, then she would be allowed to come in. But if she requested to see him and he did not lift that scepter, then she would immediately be killed. So it's not like us just going to talk to our husband or to a family member. It could have meant death for her. Esther was terrified, and she had no idea what to do. So Mordecai sent her this message back. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will arise from another place, but you will perish. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And this is one, if you have studied Esther, this is one of those key points in Esther. And in fact, I had that verse at my old house hanging up. Mordecai is telling her, relief is going to come from somewhere at some time. He has faith. It may not be to save the Jews at that time, but because the Jews were God's chosen people, at some point in time, the Jews were going to be able to rise back up. So he had faith. And he said, if you don't do something right now, you're just going to perish with everyone else. So why really be scared about Xerxes killing you when you're going to perish anyway? And the second thing he said was that maybe God made you queen because of this moment. All those times we talked about, all the coincidences that happened in her life so far for her to be queen weren't coincidences. Maybe God was moving at this time for her. Esther, if she decided to do this, she would have to reveal herself as a Jew. Some of our most important moments come hand in hand with our willingness to reveal who we really are. We might have some people in our life that we maybe act a little bit different or play a different role in, but for her to be able to go to the king and plead for his mercy, she had to reveal her true self. In a crisis situation as this, there is no neutral position. We've talked about this with some of the social things, especially some of the racial social things that have been going on in the news over the past couple months. There is just standing there is making a decision. You have to make some kind of decision. You have to decide what you're going to do. There's no neutral in it because you're deciding by being neutral. So we see Queen Esther make her decision. In verses 15 through 17, she says, "Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, 'Go and gather together all of the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast just as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish.' So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions." This is a really important, pivotal point because up until now, Esther had listened to Mordecai. Her whole life, he had kind of been in control. He had led her. She had followed him. But now she's making the decisions, and he is following what she says. We saw earlier that hard times can lead us to growing closer to God, but hard times can also lead us to our identity and our true purpose. At this time, Esther was becoming who she was meant to be through this hard situation. Now, this is going to lead us into chapter 5. It starts out where Esther is really nervous. And that's okay. If you have taken up an identity and you feel like God has you in a certain place for a certain time, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. You're still going to be nervous. You're still going to be scared about things, and that's okay to do. She was very nervous. So we're going to look at the first 2 verses of this chapter. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Just think, after 3 days of fasting with no food or water, she's going to look a lot different than she did when she had all those beauty treatments and all of that stuff going on with her. And she was chosen as queen, at least in her mind, because of her looks. So now she's going in scared about what she has to do, scared about how she has to reveal who she is, and also not looking as good as she once looked. So she put on those royal robes because she knew her identity. She was the queen. So clothed in that royal robes gave her that confidence. Just like we've talked a lot about how we are sons and daughters of God, when we put on those royal robes as his son or daughter, that can give us confidence in our spirit, just like it gave Esther. Now, this is one of my favorite parts of this, because instead of going directly to Xerxes, you would think, he's let her in, she's going to go directly to him, and she's going to start pleading her case. Well, instead of doing that, she asked him a question. She says, my petition, first she asked him, we're going to go to that verse in just a minute. First she asked him just to have a banquet. She said, can we just get together and have a banquet with me, you, and Haman of all people? So they get together and they have a banquet. At this first banquet, this is what she says. My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases my king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for him. Then I will answer the king's question. So some scholars believe there's kind of a break in the text there. So she's at this banquet and she says, and I love to envision stories. And so she's at this banquet and she's sitting there talking, and she's so nervous. I can just imagine sweaty hands getting ready. And she says, okay, this is my request. And then there's a pause there. Some scholars believe that she decided to have the second banquet because she just lost her nerve. She was just scared, just said, let's just have another banquet with everybody. But some scholars believe that she was a little more sneaky than that and asked Haman to come a second time because she wanted Xerxes to start thinking, hey, why does my wife keep wanting Haman to come to our banquets? Is something going on between them? So there would already be something kind of in the back of Xerxes' mind against Haman. So like I said, scholars think both of those. I kind of personally like to go with the second idea just because I think that's kind of fun. But we don't know her exact intent in that. Now, so let's look at how Haman felt. He got to be at one banquet with the king and the queen, and now he's invited to another banquet. Remember, he just wants to always be in control and wants people to think he's awesome. So Esther 5:9 tells us, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage again against Mordecai. So Haman had just come from this banquet. He was getting everything he wanted. He was asked to come to another banquet. But as soon as he walked out and saw Mordecai, all that rage and anger just came back. And I'm sure, at least for me, I guess I can't speak for you, but that has happened in my own life, that there may be someone that I'm feeling anger with or some situation that has happened. And I think, if only I could change that situation, I would be happy. And maybe something awesome happened, and then one little thing brings me back to that person or that situation. And it just overwhelms me, and I get so angry about that. That's what was going on with Haman. Now, we've talked about Xerxes' friends. Haman's friends are just as bad. So after all of this, after seeing Mordecai, Haman goes back to his house. He hangs out with his wife and his friends, and he's so upset. And so he comes up with a plan with his friends. And this plan's a little crazy. What he wants to do is take Mordecai and build a big pole that he wants to impale him on in front of the whole kingdom. So that's what we do when we get mad at someone. We just impale them. And that was, at that time, that was a punishment for traitors. So he kind of saw him as a traitor. So hard times can bring us closer to God. Hard times can help us find our true identity, but sometimes hard times can also lead us to foolish decisions. So when we're in those hard times and we have those things going on, we have to think through. Take a minute, step back. Make sure instead of getting around friends who maybe think the same way that you do, get around some godly friends who can help you talk that through. Haman was so consumed with the revenge that he wanted on Mordecai that he could not get past that. Through our study of Esther, we've talked about how God is always in control, no matter what. And I love that we sang Waymaker today because the words of that song are so true in this. God actually isn't even mentioned in the book of Esther at all, but we see him in the background working and working. So in the beginning of chapter 6, we're going to see some coincidences that happen through this. It says that verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6, that night the king, so we're looking at King Xerxes, couldn't sleep. So he ordered the book of Chronicles to be read, the record of his reign. He found that it was recorded there that Mordecai had exposed a plot to kill him. Now remember way back in chapter 1 where we had talked about that, where Mordecai was at the king's gate and he had made that plot. Xerxes at this time had been king for 13 years. So he had 13 books of Chronicles that he could have read from. The time that Mordecai was able to find that plot was actually 5 years before. So it was just this coincidence that he just happened to pull out this annual that just happened to read the part of that year that Mordecai saved him. At the exact same time that Haman is working with his friends to make this pole to impale Haman. To impale Mordecai. So we can see kind of that working of God behind the scenes all of the time. Now, I love this scene because the next morning, King Xerxes is just in the court. He's thinking about how he can honor Mordecai. What can I do? Because I saw he never got honored. So he just yells out to one of the people in the court, "Hey, is there anybody out there? Because I want to talk to somebody." Well, Haman is on his way in to tell King Xerxes about his plans to kill Mordecai. And so someone says, "Oh yeah, Haman's out here." He said, "Oh, bring him in. So Haman comes in, and King Xerxes says, "Haman, tell me, if you think that I had someone I would want to honor, how do you think I should honor that person?" Well, of course, Haman instantly thinks, "Oh, he wants to honor me, so I'm going to find some really good ways to get honored." So this is how he answers the king. And remember, this is again Haman talking. "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and let them lead the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" So he thought of the biggest kind of parade, the biggest thing that he could do. Now remember, the whole time, Haman is thinking this is going to happen to him. And Xerxes, his response is one of the very best plot twists in all of Scripture. He says, "Go at once. Go get the horse and the robe and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gates. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Now, imagine how Haman felt at that time. Now, I can't see your faces because you all have masks, and I can't see your faces at home, but you should be laughing right now because it is the best thing ever. This guy that we don't like because he's just shifty and mean has just got it, because now he has to get all of these things for Mordecai, who he hates. gets the robe, gets the horse, and he now has to lead Mordecai through the courts and through the city, saying, this is what happens to the man the king wants to honor. And I mean, I can just see him walking there going, this is what happens to the king, all those things, because I'm sure he does not want to do that. He thought he was going to be the one that was going to get honored. So hard times, we talked about all the different ways that hard times can help. But another way that hard times can help is also that hard times can lead you to a deeper trust at this time. Now, this is the end of chapter 6. Nothing has changed, really. Nothing has happened. The edict is still out. The Jews are still going to get slaughtered. Esther has not yet talked to King Xerxes about this. So nothing has happened. But because Mordecai was honored, because the king let Esther come in, you can feel the workings of God. You know that something is stirring. So even though nothing on the outside has happened, lots of things on the inside have happened, because there is hope now. There's that movement. We can see things ready to go. And we still have more chapters left to go next week for the ending of our story. So there's still a great story at the end, but we can just feel that change. So think about in your own life, maybe there's some things that haven't on the outside changed. It still looks hopeless. Things are still going on with your relationships, with your finances. Things are going on. But inside, because you have that hope of God, and you know that stirring, you know that he is the waymaker, that he's the promise keeper, that you know that things will get better. I don't know where you're at in your life right now. You might be having great times right now. You might not have hardly any struggles going on. But you might also be in some really hard times right now. If you're in the middle of those hard times, I want you to think about some of the things that we talked about. Are you being led back to God? Through those hard times, are you looking back to him? Are you running further away from him? Have you forgotten who you are, your true identity? Look around and see. If you're having hard times because of where you're placed, your job, maybe even where you're at right now, think about, why has God put me here? He has me here for something, for this time, for this place. There's a reason that I'm here. Be careful during these hard times not to make those foolish, rash decisions, but instead be patient and develop that deeper trust in him. Let's go ahead and bow our heads and close our eyes.